welcome to Cleveland Classic Cinema. Tonight we're going to do something different. I know all of you out there are waiting for the usual sucky movie this week, but I can only expect the 12 of you to put up with that for so long. Know that I appreciate you tuning in week after week to watch the garbage that gets broadcast on this show. And though I know you, like me, have an abnormally high tolerance to bad film, every once in a while you have to take a break. Too much candy will make you sick, after all. So tonight I'm going to reintroduce you to someone who is, in my humble opinion, one of the best comics that ever lived. Jack Benny. The Jack Benny program ran on TV from 1950 to 1965. Before that, he started his own radio show on NBC from 1932 to 1948, and then moved to CBS, where he hosted his show from 1949 to 1958 before making the jump to TV. Before that, he appeared in vaudeville and on Broadway, in addition to appearing in a movie or two. He was one of the most popular comedians in the world, and, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's focus on the man himself. First of all, his character was the polar opposite of the real man. On stage, Benny played a man who was vain, bossy, cowardly, and incredibly cheap. This persona was invented by Benny himself and his stable of writers, nearly all of whom worked with him during the entire span of his career. In anyone else's hands, the character he played would have been hard to manage. The character was so incredibly stingy, selfish, and vain that making him likable would have been nearly impossible. Jack Benny and his writers created a formula that took everyday situations, everyday for them at least, and filled it with some of the most bizarre, free-form comedy ever showcased in the public airways at that time. In real life, he was an incredibly generous, kind, and thoughtful man who loved to laugh so much that he would literally collapse and pound the floor as he laughed wildly. See, the truly amazing thing about Jack Benny was that he was more than willing to step back and let his guests get not only the laughs, but the better of his character. When asked why he did that, he once replied, "I don't care who gets the laughs on my show, as long as the show is funny." There are very few stars these days that are willing to step back and let someone else get the limelight, much less be the butt of the jokes, especially on their own shows. Benny was also the head writer, although he never took credit. The Jack Benny program started out as a variety show, incorporating comedy and musical production numbers, but eventually changed to situation comedy, pioneering the genre. Any situation from shopping for Christmas presents to Jack's house getting robbed was used by Benny and his excellent team of writers as fodder for some of the most outlandish, surreal jokes ever done on radio and TV at the time. Benny had a tremendous eye for talent, and he surrounded himself with an absolutely wonderful supporting cast. His wisecracking sometime girlfriend and wife in real life, Mary Livingston, the perpetually befuddled and befuddling Irish tenor, Dennis Day, his rotund announcer, Don Wilson, voice expert Mel Blanc, singer and bandleader Bob Crosby, the superb comic singer and dancer Eddie Rochester Anderson, and a constantly revolving series of minor supporting character actors such as B. Benaderet, Frank Nelson, and the wonderful Sheldon Leonard. Eddie Anderson in particular was an innovative character. He played Benny's manservant, but was treated as an equal in the fictional household. He was more Jack's friend than his servant, and consistently got off some of the best cracks at his boss's expense, often ones about how cheap Jack was and how badly he played the violin. The equality Benny treated Anderson with was even more evident in real life. Once, when Benny and his staff were touring the country, they were appearing in St. Joseph, Missouri. On checking into the Robidoux Hotel, they were told by the desk staff that the hotel was restricted and Eddie Anderson couldn't stay there. Benny then refused to stay at the establishment, saying that if Anderson couldn't stay there, neither would he. The hotel relented and gave Rochester a suite. Jack Benny was born Benjamin Kubelski on February 14, 1894 in Chicago, Illinois, and grew up in nearby Waukegan, Wisconsin. He began studying violin at the age of 6, and by the age of 14 was performing in various dance bands, graduating to performing in the orchestras of vaudeville theaters by the age of 17. The following year, he changed his name for the first time after teaming up with a pianist named Cora Salisbury, and was threatened with legal action by famous violinist Jan Kubelik, who was afraid that he would be confused with the young violinist. Jack changed his stage name to Ben K. Benny. When Salisbury left the act, he reteamed with another pianist by the name of Lyman Woods, and dubbed the act From Grand Opera to Ragtime. They made it as far as the Palace Theater, but bombed there. He joined the Navy in 1917, entertaining the troops with his violin playing, and once, when being booed off the stage, ad-libbed his way out of the mess at the goading of fellow sailor and actor Pat O'Brien. He became a hit. He combined his playing with comedy and started a one-man act calling it Benny K. Benny, Fiddle Phonology. He was threatened with another lawsuit by Ben Burney, another fiddler comedian, and changed his name one last time to Jack Benny. In 1922, Benny met Sadie Marks, and they were married after Jack courted her for nearly 5 years, often stopping at the May Company where she worked to chat her up. When she stood in for a missing actress during one of his performances, he found that she had a natural talent and she became his partner in performing, as was usual back then. Vaudeville performers spent most, if not the entire year, touring the country, so wives were often integrated into the act. He was signed to a 5-year contract with MGM in 1929, but was released when his second film, Chasing Rainbows, flopped. He went back to the stage and entered radio in 1932. Radio's The Jack Benny Program ran from 1932 to 1948 on NBC, and then in 1949, Jack and family moved to CBS, where they remained until the show went off the air in 1955. One of the many running gags Benny had throughout a better portion of his career was stating his age at 39. It started when his 39th birthday was celebrated on his show, and the next year, he celebrated it again, commenting that there's nothing funny about turning 40. From that day on, when asked his age, he stated that he was 39. In 1945, Benny made a film called The Horn Blows at Midnight, directed by Raoul Walsh. It failed spectacularly at the box office and created yet another running gag for Benny, who mentioned it countless times on his radio and TV shows. The Jack Benny program came to TV in 1950, and audiences finally got to see the entire act Benny had perfected over the decades. His comedy was as much physical as it was verbal, although not in the usual sense. His physical comedy was relegated mainly to reacting to the bizarre situations he found himself in, usually resulting in his taking a long pause after the punchline of the joke that more often than not doubled the laugh the joke got to begin with. CBS dropped the show in 1964, saying that Benny didn't attract a young enough audience. The show moved to NBC for a year, and then Benny retired from regular productions, appearing once or so a year in various variety specials and making guest appearances on his friends' shows, such as the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and The Lucy Show, in addition to making hundreds of live appearances. He worked nearly for the rest of his life and never lost his skill or his timing. In December of 1974, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Jack Benny died at home on December 26, 1974. He was 39. Edmund Lincoln Anderson was born on September 18, 1905 in Oakland, California. He damaged his vocal cords at an early age while shouting headlines while selling newspapers, which gave him his trademark raspy voice. He began his career at the age of 14, appearing with his brother Cornelius and another performer in a song and dance act called The Three Black Aces. He first appeared on the Jack Benny radio show in the role of a Pullman porter, and his performance was so popular that Benny brought him back and hired him away from the railroad to give him a job as his personal valet. He became the second most popular character on the show, rivaling Benny himself. His full character name, rarely used on the show, was Rochester Van Jones. His role as a servant was usual of the roles black performers had at the time. Early in his stint as Rochester, Anderson played craps and carried a switchblade. But when World War II hit and Benny realized the extent of racism inherent in the Nazi philosophy, he rid the character of the stereotypical touches it was originally written with. After this, when the humor in reference to Rochester had elements of stereotyping in it, the joke always came from Anderson himself, thus diffusing the racial element. Speaking for myself, that's one of the things I really admire about Eddie Anderson. The fact that he was adult enough to laugh at himself and not get all bent out of shape about what was, after all was said and done, a joke. It seems people today are so wrapped up in taking themselves seriously that they can't laugh at themselves anymore, which is a shame. Everybody needs to laugh every day, even if it's at yourself. Eddie Anderson died of heart failure on February 28, 1977 in Los Angeles, California. The universe that the Jack Benny program existed in has never been equaled and, as far as I know, has never been duplicated. For instance, Frank Nelson played a recurring character that Benny ran into nearly everywhere he went. He played a floor walker, a carnival guess-your-age booth operator, a gangster, a ticket agent. The list is endless. He nearly always made his entrance to the show with his back turned to the audience, and Benny would approach him saying, "Oh, mister, whereupon Nelson would spin around with an oily, "Yes?" This always makes me laugh because I know a hilariously caustic exchange is about to take place between Benny and Nelson. No matter what question Benny asks, Nelson always has a snide reply ready. And the really great thing about it is that Benny remembers running into him before. The Frank Nelson segments were one of my favorite parts of the Jack Benny program, but they're nuggets in a motherload. When I was young, I would watch Warner Brothers cartoons and laugh wildly at them. I still do, actually, but I never realized how much of the humor in them was topical. And I was really floored the first time I saw Sheldon Leonard on the Jack Benny program. He was born Leonard Sheldon Burchard on February 22, 1907 in New York City. He usually played mugs or gangsters in supporting roles throughout his acting career, and occasionally had some positive roles as cops and such, but had much more success behind the camera as a producer and director. He created, produced, and sometimes directed episodes of The Danny Thomas Show, The Andy Griffith Show, The Dick Van Dyke Show, and I Spy. He himself cast Bill Cosby as the co-lead in the latter show, a groundbreaking move in the mid-1960s. Well, getting back to the Warner Brothers cartoons, anyone familiar with them will recognize this setup. A character, usually a fox, in a houndstooth jacket and cap, leaning against a building and saying to a passing character, "Hey, bud, yeah, you, come here," and go from there. What I didn't know was that that particular bit was lifted wholesale from the performances of Sheldon Leonard on The Benny Show, and I've included an episode where he does that so you can watch the master at work. Fans of 1946's It's a Wonderful Life will recognize him as the actor who played Nick the bartender. Sheldon Leonard died of natural causes on January 10, 1997 in Beverly Hills, California. Don Wilson was born on September 1, 1900 in Lincoln, Nebraska. Best known as an announcer, he began his career in sportscasting, covering the opening of the 1932 Olympic Games in Berlin. He was an excellent announcer, rarely if ever blowing his lines. But on one Benny program, he slipped out and let out a spoonerism, calling newsman Drew Pearson Dreer Poosin. In the freewheeling style of the show, Frank Nelson took advantage of Wilson's flub later when Benny, talking to his character, asked, "Pardon me, are you the doorman?" And Nelson shot back, "Well, who do you think I am, Dreer Poosin?" Wilson was a target of a lot of fat jokes on The Benny Show, but he played them off beautifully. He died of a stroke on April 25, 1982 in Cathedral City, California. Dennis Day was born Owen Patrick Eugene McNulty on May 21, 1916 in Bronx, New York. A born singer, he was in the St. Patrick's Cathedral Choir, and after graduating high school, aimed at a career in law, singing in order to earn money for tuition. He recorded a song called I Never Knew Heaven Could Speak and distributed it himself to various producers. A copy fell into Mary Benny's hands, and she became so enchanted with his voice that she insisted her husband Jack audition him. His show already had a tenor named Kenny Baker, but he was dissatisfied with his role as the airheaded singer and had served notice. When he auditioned, Benny called him in his usual way, "Oh, Dennis!" And Day answered, "Yes, please." His reply cracked up everyone in the studio, including Benny, who hired him on the spot. He did have a beautiful Irish tenor voice and was so convincing in his wide-eyed confusion that he became an instant hit on the show, remaining loyal to Benny for the rest of his life, despite making guest appearances on many other shows due to his enormous popularity. He appeared in 24 movies and TV shows over the course of his career and became a voiceover artist towards the end of his life. Dennis Day died of Lou Gehrig's disease on June 22, 1988. Melvin Jerome Blanc was born on May 30, 1908 in San Francisco, California. His family moved to Portland, Oregon, and he grew up there. His last name was originally spelled B-L-A-N-K, but he changed it to B-L-A-N-C after a teacher told him that he would grow up to become nothing just like his name, Blank. He began his radio career in 1927, providing voices for several characters on the Hoot Owls program, and in 1935 moved to Los Angeles, where he appeared on the Warner-owned station KFWB. He joined up with the Benny program in the late 30s, becoming one of Jack's closest friends. Blanc did dozens of voices on the show, in addition to playing Benny's 1929 Maxwell automobile. Originally, the sound of the Maxwell was taken from a phonograph record, but during one show, Blanc noticed the record wasn't queued up when it was about to go on the air, so he stepped up to a microphone and ad-libbed the sound of the car. The audience loved it, and Benny made Blanc the voice of the Maxwell from that moment on. One of the many running gags on the show was Blanc as a train announcer who inevitably toned, "Train leaving on track 5 for Anaheim, Azusa, and Cucamonga." The original joke behind this gag was that Los Angeles audiences knew that no train had stops at those small towns. As the gag continued to run, however, Blanc began taking longer and longer pauses between kook and amanga, and the laughs got bigger each time. In fact, the moment Blanc announced the first few words of the sentence, the audience would begin to laugh in anticipation of the end of the joke. On one show, a completely different skit began and ended before amanga was finally announced. As everyone knows, Blanc was a resident voice artist for the Warner Brothers cartoon studio, although when he first applied there, he was turned down by music director Norman Spencer, who was also in charge of cartoon voices. When Spencer died, he was replaced by musical director Carl Stalling, and soundman Treg Brown was put in charge of voices. He introduced Blanc to the directors Tex Avery, Bob Clampett, Fritz Feeling, and Frank Tashlin, who put him to work immediately. The first voice he reinvented was that of Porky Pig, who up until that time had been voiced by someone who really stuttered. I have seen the Porky cartoons that were made before Blanc joined the studio, and while I enjoyed them, I always felt a little uncomfortable watching Porky try to talk. I remember one cartoon where a young Porky was trying to recite the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, and I didn't really think it was that funny. I myself don't stutter, but I imagine it's a tremendously frustrating impediment to have. What Blanc did was take Porky's stutter and make it funny. Instead of struggling to get out the words, Porky starts on one and then switches to another word that means the same thing but doesn't contain the syllable he can't enunciate. That makes a huge difference in the humor of the situation. Of course, Porky was only one of the dozens and dozens of voices Blanc did for Warner's, but many people don't realize that he didn't do the voice of Elmer Fudd. Elmer's voice was done by another actor named Arthur Q. Bryan. After Bryan died, Blanc made one attempt to duplicate Elmer's voice in the cartoon The Scarlet Pumpernickel, but it didn't work out very well. For all his amazing talent, Blanc was unable to duplicate Bryan's voice, and the character was quietly retired. Blanc also originated the voice of Woody Woodpecker for the Walter Lantz Studios, although he only did 4 cartoons. He was placed under exclusive contract by Leon Schlesinger soon after this, so from then on, Woody's voice was supplied first by animator Ben Hardaway, then by Lance's wife, Grace Stafford. In 1960, Blanc was involved in a near-fatal head-on car crash and ended up in a coma. His doctor, who was a fan of his Warner Brothers cartoons, couldn't get him to come out of the coma, so one day he walked into Blanc's room and asked, "And how are we today, Bugs Bunny?" And Blanc answered in Bugs' voice, "What's up, Doc?" The doctor continued to address Blanc using the names of the characters he voiced, and eventually brought him out of the coma. Blanc once recalled that he was receiving a throat exam by a very well-known Hollywood specialist, and the doctor said he had only seen throat muscles like Blanc's in one other person, Enrico Caruso. Mel Blanc died from heart disease on July 10, 1989 in Hollywood, California. At his request, the words, "That's all, folks," were carved on his headstone. Soon after his death, the Warner cartoon issued a hand-painted cell entitled Speechless in tribute to him. Mary Livingston was born Sadie Marks on June 23, 1905 in Seattle, Washington. Raised in Vancouver, British Columbia, she first met Jack Benny at a Passover Seder she attended with her cousin, Zeppo Marks. She developed an instant crush on him, but Benny inadvertently insulted her when he left during her violin performance later that night. She got revenge on him by going with 3 of her girlfriends to Benny's performance the next night and sitting in the front row with their arms crossed, not even cracking a smile. Benny never forgot that, later saying it drove him crazy that he couldn't get those girls to laugh. They met again a few years later on a blind date, and Benny fell for Mary hard, visiting her at the hosiery counter at the May Company, where she held a job as a sales lady. He was determined to marry her and talked her into it in 1927. One night she received an emergency phone call from her husband. An actress that was supposed to play a small role on the show couldn't make it, so he asked Sadie to fill in for her. She played a character named Mary Livingston, who was the president of the Jack Benny fan club. She appeared once more and the character was written out of the show. She did so well in the role, however, that CBS was bombarded with fan mail for her, and she became a regular character on the show, moving up from the fan club president to Benny's secretary/girlfriend, eventually legally changing her name to Mary Livingston. She had a bit of a propensity for spoonerisms, her most famous being asking for a Chiss Squeeze sandwich on an episode of the radio show. The writers and cast ran with that one for years. Although her character on radio and TV was easygoing and likable, in real life Mary was a vain, jealous, insecure woman. George Burns, Benny's best friend, said in his memoir, Gracie, A Love Story, that while he and Gracie and the rest of Benny's friends loved him, they merely tolerated Mary. Mary herself claimed that the famous pose Benny struck with his hand to his cheek came about because she had answered a phone call from one of his girlfriends, scratched his cheek, and he was forced to cover it at a photo session later that day. Their adopted daughter, Joan, remembered in her book, Sunday Nights at 7. She had so many good qualities: her sense of humor, her generosity, her loyalty to her friends. She had a famous, successful, and adoring husband. She had famous, interesting, and amusing friends. She lived in luxury. She was a celebrity in her own right. In short, she had everything a woman could possibly want. When I think of her, it's with sadness because I wish she could have enjoyed it all more. Around the time the TV show premiered, Mary developed severe stage fright and rarely appeared on the program. Although they loved each other very much, Mary's vanity and Jack's philandering sometimes put a strain on their marriage. They weathered their personal problems, however, and remained married until Jack's death in 1974. Benny's will stipulated that one red rose was to be delivered to his wife every day, which it was until her death from heart disease on June 30th, 1983, in Holmby Hills, Los Angeles, California. Before we get started, let me tell you one more story about Jack Benny. He was good friends with President Harry Truman, and on one of his visits to the White House, he was carrying his violin and was stopped at the door by a Secret Service agent who demanded to know what was in the case. Thinking to make a joke of the situation, Benny replied, "A machine gun," and the Secret Service agent smiled and said, "Thank goodness, I thought it was your violin." So right now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the Jack Benny program, right here on Cleveland Classic Cinema.